In 1980, a 19-year-old man named Bobby Shafran arrived at Sullivan County Community College in New York for his first day. Students kept stopping him in the hallway, smiling at him, slapping him on the back, calling him Eddie. He didn't know anyone named Eddie. He had never been to this college before. He had no idea what was happening. A student named Michael Domitz finally stopped and asked him directly, "Are you adopted?" Bobby said yes. Michael said, "I think you have a twin brother." His name was Eddie Galland. He had attended the same college the previous year. And when Bobby and Eddie met, the photographs speak for themselves. The same face, the same laugh, the same mannerisms, the same gestures, identical in every visible way. The story made the newspapers. And then a third young man saw the news coverage and felt the ground shift beneath him. His name was David Kelman. He was also 19. He was also adopted. He was also identical to both of them. 3 brothers, separated at birth, raised in 3 different families. None of them had ever been told the other existed. The reunion was joyful. It became a media sensation. It felt for a while like the kind of story that ends well. It did not end well. And the reason it didn't end well is the reason we are here today. Welcome back to The Darkest Experiments. We have spent Chapter 5 in the territory of identity, watching science reach inside the most intimate dimensions of a person's self and attempt to rearrange what it found there. We have been with David Reimer, whose gender was reassigned without his consent. We have been with the soldiers of Ward 22, whose sexuality was subjected to electric shock and chemical intervention. Now we arrive at the final experiment of Chapter 5, and it is different from the others in a way that makes it, in some respects, the most quietly disturbing of all, because it did not involve surgery or shocks or any procedure that leaves a visible mark. It involved a decision made in an office, recorded in a file, and then locked away for decades. A decision about twins, about who they would be, and about whether they would ever know each other. Beginning in the early 1960s, a child psychologist named Peter Neubauer, working with the Louise Wise Adoption Agency in New York, initiated a study designed to investigate one of the oldest and most fundamental questions in psychology. What shapes a human being more, nature or nurture? Genetics or environment? It was a legitimate scientific question. It remains one today. And there is, in principle, no better way to investigate it than by studying identical twins, individuals who share virtually all of their genetic material, raised in different environments. The differences between them, in theory, can be attributed to environment. The similarities can be attributed to genetics. Neubauer understood this, and he had access, through his relationship with the Louise Wise Agency, to something that made the study possible in a way that no ethical framework would have permitted him to design from scratch. He had twins, identical twins and triplets, surrendered for adoption, passing through the agency's hands in the 1960s. And he made a decision, one that was never disclosed to the adoptive families, never disclosed to the children, and never published in any scientific journal during his lifetime. He would separate them, deliberately. Systematically, he would place them in families of different socioeconomic backgrounds and different family structures. And he would follow their development over time, comparing nature against nurture in the most controlled real-world setting imaginable. The adoptive parents were not told they were adopting a twin. They were told, if they asked about the periodic follow-up visits from researchers, that it was a routine study of child development, nothing more. The children grew up not knowing that somewhere in the world, someone who shared their face and their DNA was living a parallel life. Bobby, Eddie, and David, the triplets whose reunion launched the story into public consciousness, were among Neubauer's subjects. Their story was documented in the 2018 film 3 Identical Strangers, which introduced millions of people to what had been done and why. The early chapters of their reunion story are genuinely joyful. 3 young men discovering each other, finishing each other's sentences, sharing the same taste in food, the same physical mannerisms, the same laugh. The nature side of Neubauer's equation playing out in real time. They moved in together. They appeared on television. They opened a restaurant. For a brief, bright period, it seemed as though the story that had been hidden from them had given them something extraordinary when it finally surfaced. But as the documentary traces their lives forward, the shadow beneath the joy becomes impossible to ignore. All 3 of the triplets struggled with mental health challenges throughout their lives. The researchers who followed them had noted, in their assessments, significant differences in the family environments they had been placed in. One family was working class, one middle class, one upper middle class. One of the 3 had been placed with a father the researchers described as emotionally cold and withholding. That triplet was Eddie. Eddie Galland died by suicide in 1995. He was 33 years old. His brothers have spent the decades since trying to understand what the study knew, when it knew it, and whether anyone who held that knowledge could have intervened. Peter Neubauer never published the findings of the study. The reasons for this are not entirely clear. He died in 2008, and his public statements on the matter were evasive. What is known is that at some point he arranged for the study's records to be sealed and donated to Yale University's archives, where they will remain inaccessible to the public until 2065. Not to researchers, not to ethics committees, not to the people who were studied, to everyone. The people most directly affected, the twins and triplets who were separated and the siblings of those who died, cannot access the records that document what was done to them and what was observed. They cannot know what the researchers saw in those follow-up visits. They cannot know whether warning signs were noted and ignored. They cannot know whether Eddie's death was something the study's data might have predicted. That sealed archive is not a neutral act. It is a choice made by a researcher who understood on some level that what he had done would not survive public scrutiny, to place his legacy beyond the reach of accountability for over a century. Bobby, Eddie, and David were not the only subjects of Neubauer's study. Other twins and siblings, some of whom have only discovered their separated status in recent years, through DNA testing services like 23andMe, are still finding each other, still processing the revelation, still working through what it means to have been an experimental subject from birth without ever being told. Some of these reunions have been joyful. Some have been complicated. Some have arrived too late, the separated sibling already gone, the opportunity for a relationship closed before it could be opened. Each of these people carries a version of the same question. What would my life have been if someone had not decided, in an office in New York in the 1960s, that my twin and I were more valuable to science apart than we were to each other together? The separated twin study is, in ethical terms, one of the clearest violations in this entire series. Not because the methodology was brutal. It was not, in the immediate physical sense, but because it treated the most fundamental human bonds, the bond between twins who share a face, a history, a biology, as a variable to be controlled. The study required as its foundational condition that the subjects never know what had been done to them. Its entire design depended on deception. Not a temporary deception, not a deception that would be reversed at the end of a session, but a permanent, lifelong deception sustained across families, institutions, and decades. A deception that, in at least one case, contributed to the conditions in which a young man lost his life. No ethical review board operating under modern standards would permit a study with this design to proceed. The requirement of informed consent from participants, and in the case of infants from their guardians, is not a bureaucratic formality. It is a recognition that human beings are not variables, that their relationships, their identities, and their knowledge of their own origins are not resources available for scientific appropriation. Neubauer's study treated them as exactly that, and then sealed the evidence. The separated twins study is a story about what we owe each other as human beings, about the relationships and truths that belong to us by right, not by permission. Bobby, Eddie, and David did not need a researcher's approval to be brothers. That was simply what they were, from the first moment. In every cell. The study also asks us to sit with what secrecy does over time. Neubauer sealed those records not for the benefit of science, not for the protection of participants, but to preserve something, perhaps his reputation, perhaps his theoretical legacy, perhaps simply the ability to avoid a reckoning he knew was coming. And the people who paid the price of that secrecy were the ones who had already paid the highest price at birth. There is something in this story that speaks to every context in which information is withheld from the people most affected by it, in medicine, in families, in organizations and institutions. The argument for withholding is often framed as protection, protecting feelings, protecting stability, protecting the person from a truth they might not be able to handle. But what Bobby and Eddie and David's story tells us is that people can handle the truth. What they cannot always survive is the weight of the gap where the truth should have been. Tell people what they need to know about themselves. They have earned it. It belongs to them. Eddie Galland, Bobby Shafran, and David Kellman were separated the day they were born. They found each other at 19 by accident, by a chance resemblance noticed in a college hallway. They had 11 years together before Eddie was gone. Those 11 years were real. The brotherhood was real. The study that tried to reduce them to variables in a nature versus nurture equation could not change that and could not take it back. That closes Chapter 5. We have been inside the deepest questions of identity, of gender, of sexuality, of the irreducible bond between siblings, and we have watched science reach into each of them with confident, careless hands. In Chapter 6, we go somewhere colder and stranger. We leave the individual self behind and enter the territory of the brain itself, of what governments and institutions have been willing to do to the human mind in the name of control, intelligence, and the relentless desire to understand what is inside us. We begin with the most elaborate and well-funded mind control program in American history. It involved the CIA, LSD, unwitting prisoners, and a level of institutional secrecy that took decades to crack. That is Project MKUltra. And it is one of the most extraordinary stories in this entire series. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Leave a comment of all the experiments in Chapter 5. Which one stayed with you longest? I want to hear your answer. And thank you genuinely for being here. I'll see you in the next one.